everyone. Today we are going to be focusing on explaining the long association between outsiders and disease historically in the United States. If you remember from our last lesson, we discussed how people were associating COVID with Chinese immigrants and the discrimination that Chinese immigrants are facing all over the world because of the current COVID crisis. So, taking a look at us historically, in new immigrants. So if you remember back to our unit when we discussed immigration, we discussed the difference between new immigrants and old immigrants. So old immigrants typically came from Western Europe, Western Europe, and were typically English speaking. Were typically middle class immigrants that were coming to America. Between 1807 and 1920, that changed. And we started to see Europeans arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe, so mainly non-English speaking countries. And many of them were coming because they were facing religious persecution in their home countries, so they were coming for religious freedom. There was rising population in their countries, and there weren't enough jobs, so they came for job opportunities. So it created a little bit of hostility between Americans that were here and the new immigrants that were coming in this fear of job competition. This not only occurred with Europeans, but also with Chinese and Japanese immigrants. So between 1851 and 1883, approximately 300,000 Chinese had arrived on the West Coast through what we know as Angel Island. So I'm going to add that in there. And most Europeans came through Ellis Island. And a lot of Chinese came for a couple reasons. One, they first came because of the gold rush. So we know that there was gold rush taking place in California. And so they came in search of that. And as you know, many people looking for the gold rush were not successful. And so many ended up working on the railroads. We talked about the Transcontinental Railroad and how Chinese immigrants were crucial in ensuring that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And again, as I mentioned before, this caused a lot of conflict. New immigrants were viewed as a threat to the Americans' way of life. Many of them had different cultures and different beliefs that Americans didn't understand, and so therefore created a lot of hostility. There was also this new belief, what we called nativism, and this was a favoritism towards native-born Americans. This belief that Anglo-Saxons were superior to other races. In the West, there was a fear that Chinese would take jobs. And this eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned the entry of all Chinese except for students, teachers, merchants, tourists, and government officials. So essentially any lower class Chinese were banned, and they only allowed middle and upper class Chinese to enter into this country. And this led to a life of discrimination against these new immigrants. We tended to see that immigrants arriving in steerage. So steerage was the lower class or third class, typically the bottom of the boat. They faced more medical discrimination than those arriving in first or second class between the years of 1870 and 1940, arriving both at Angel Island and at Ellis Island. We know that immigrants arriving in steerage not only faced medical discrimination, so had to go through more elaborate testing, but they also were disinfected with chemical agents. So if any of you guys remember, the FDA didn't exist in 1870, and by 1940 still didn't have a strong presence. And so they were using strong chemical agents against these new immigrants that were arriving into the country to try to quote unquote disinfect them. And we know that between 1910 and 1940, Chinese immigrants, more than any other ethnicity, were disproportionately barred, meaning that they were prevented from entering the United States for medical reasons. So more than any other ethnicity group, based off percentages, Chinese immigrants were not allowed into the country because of quote unquote medical reasons. We saw a huge increase in this over the course of the years between 1910 and 1940, where more and more Chinese immigrants were prevented from entering. And then what you are going to do today. So for your assignment today, you are going to be analyzing a political cartoon. And I thought I would use this document here as a way to prepare you for that by taking a look at some of the things I'm going to ask you to look at in your assignment today. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you in the assignment is, what is it that you notice first, right? And that's important because that's the author trying to gain your attention. So the first thing that I notice when I look at this is I actually notice two things, right? The first thing that I'm going to notice is the drawing that we have over here to the left, the man's face. And the second thing I'm going to notice is the dragon of Asia. So those are the two things that are going to stand out to me the most. And the second question that I'm going to ask you is, what are the words? So what are the labels, descriptions, thoughts, or dialogue in the document itself? In this case, we see 1,000 lepers in Chinatown. They are referring to Chinatown in San Francisco here. The drawing that, or the political cartoon that you are looking at today in your assignment, will also refer to San Francisco. We see the American eagle, the foul bird, which defies its own nest, the dragon of Asia, triumphant at last, Eastern saints and Puritan hypocrites, Nation in the land, our Constitution to be enforced by strong arms, O'Donnell again in the lead. So what we see happening here is, so we are seeing discrimination against Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants because of this poster. The third thing that I'm going to ask you to list is the people, the objects, and the places in the cartoon. So we know that they're talking about Chinatown would be the place. We know the objects are going to be the American eagle, or the images are going to be the American eagle and a Chinese immigrant. And that's what we would list for that third question. The fourth question asks, which of the visuals are symbols and what do you think they represent? So we know there's two symbols, right? We know that one symbol is going to be the American eagle. The fact that the American eagle has to leave, it can't stay there. It's being forced to leave its own nest. And then the description of a Chinese immigrant being described as a leper. A leper is somebody who needed to be avoided or rejected because they were suffering from leprosy. So you are going to do this with a document today in the assignment. You have a political cartoon that you are going to answer those 4 questions for. And then there's going to be a couple questions following just about political cartoons in general. And you are going to submit that to me this week for your grade. All right, have a great day.